Je déclare cette réunion ouverte. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 111 du Comité de l'agriculture et agroalimentaire. Je vais commencer par quelques rappels. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule au salon, une formule hybride. Les délibérations sont diffusées sur le site web de la Chambre de commune. À titre d'information, la diffusion web montrera toujours la personne qui parle plus tôt, l'ensemble du comité. Et bien sûr, aujourd'hui, conformément à l'article 108,2 de l'Règlement et aux motions adoptées par le comité le jeudi 8
by the committee on Thursday, February 8th, 2024, and on Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of impact of border carbon adjustments and reciprocity of standards on Canadian agriculture. I would like now to welcome our witnesses for this panel.
Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, Michael Harvey, Executive Director. Welcome, Mr. Harvey. Thank you for being here today. With the Canadian Pork Council, no stranger to this committee or its members, Mr. René Roy, Chair. So very good to have you, Monsieur Roy. Bienvenue. But we also...
Welcome.
Kolamashveka. I hope I'm getting that right. You'll have to correct me on the record when we get in. And from Farmers for Climate Solutions, Genevieve Grossenbacher, Director of Policy. So welcome to all of you. As you know the drill, we'll do 5 minutes for opening remarks from each organization, and then we'll turn it over to questions from MPs. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Harvey, for up to 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is the first time I've been in a meeting chaired by someone from Hants County since I went to high school at Hants West in the 80s. Merci aux membres du comité d'avoir invité l'ACA à partager.
Thank you to the members of the committee for inviting CAFTA to share our views. CAFTA is a coalition of national organizations advocating a freer and fairer international trading environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector. CAFTA members include farmers, ranchers, processors, growers, and exporters in key trade sectors such as beef, pork, grains, oilseeds, sugar, pulses, soybeans, and processed foods. A fair and open international trading environment for the agri-food sector is in Canada's economic interest. Agri-food accounts for 1 in 9 jobs in Canada, and the majority are in the export-oriented agri-food sector. In 2022, Canada exported $92.8 billion worth of agricultural and food products. More than half of our agricultural production is exported or processed for export.
Or BCAs are a prime example of the imperative for Canada's, sorry, my voice. Not a big fan of 8:15 appearances, but BCAs are a prime example of the imperative for Canada's agri-food exporters to engage in domestic and international discussions of sustainability and trade. We believe that trade is not only important for economic and social outcomes globally, but can be a driver for improved national and international sustainability outcomes. On August 6th, we responded to this imperative by developing CAFTA's Principles for Sustainable Trade to provide a structured approach to engaging in the evolving policy discussion at the nexus of trade and sustainability and its implications for agri-food. As the world grapples with the dual challenges of feeding a growing population and protecting the environment, CAFTA's principles offer a clear roadmap for balancing these critical priorities. In our view, trade is crucial for achieving sustainable development and improving global food security. Canadian farmers, processors, and exporters grow our economy through trade. It is essential that sustainability measures do not become barriers to fairer and freer international agri-food trade or serve as cover for protectionist trade policies. We must ensure that our efforts to promote sustainability do not inadvertently create barriers or excessive burdens. Sustainability policies and trade-related climate measures must not impose unnecessary regulatory burdens, restrictions, or compliance costs on producers or the broader value chain. Applying CAFTA's sustainable trade principles to BCAs allows us to see some of the complexities of a relatively simple initial concept. CAFTA has not developed an institutional position on BCAs, but we are watching the issue as it develops internationally. Committee members have examined the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which may include sectors like agriculture in the future. CAFTA's concern with the EU CBAM is that it can become a trade barrier used in a discriminatory manner in the interest of protectionism. Measuring the carbon footprint of food products can be more complex than in other sectors due to factors such as varying agriculture practices, transportation distances, and land use changes. Agri-food exporters worry about the costs and technical challenges of tracking and reporting emissions across diverse agricultural supply chains. We are also concerned about the lack of harmonized carbon accounting standards across countries. This inconsistency could lead to confusion and disputes about how emissions are calculated and verified, adding to administrative burdens. Further, complying with carbon regulations and providing the necessary documentation to verify emissions would increase costs for food exporters. Exporters will also need to navigate complex certification processes to prove the sustainability of their agricultural practices, which could be time-consuming and costly. Such requirements could slow down trade, disrupt supply chains, and add significant financial burdens. BCAs could lead to trade disputes, especially if agricultural exporters in countries with weaker environmental regulations view these measures as protectionist. Regulatory tariffs or disputes in the WTO could arise as a result. Despite these difficulties, we are seeing other countries beyond the EU looking at border carbon adjustments. The U.S. senators have introduced ideas in their legislative process, and we recently saw the U.S. Energy Department announce a pilot project to collect statistics on the emissions of certain industrial products, an effort the administration says will help inform the White House's recently established task force on climate and trade in its work with trade partners. So in this shifting international environment, Canada may end up moving forward and adopt a CBA. We should examine the international trade implications carefully before doing so. CAFTA argued in the government's recent consideration of measures to counter Chinese electric vehicle imports that our country should take an approach consistent with our WTO obligations, underlining Canada's national interest in the global rules-based trading system and reducing the risk of retaliation. We wish to continue to insist on such approaches to international trade challenges. CBAs are an area where Canada can work with international partners multilaterally at the WTO or in regional or like-minded groups like the G7 to manage international trade in a strategic manner that serves our broader national interest. Je serai heureux de répondre à toutes vos questions. Merci.
I'd expect nothing else from a guy from Hants County, right on time. Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Maintenant, Monsieur Roy, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Allez-y.
Mr. Roy, you have 5 minutes. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the invitation, and thank you to the committee members for your work on this issue. My name is René Roy, and I'm the chair of the Canadian Pork Council. Joining me is Katerina Kolashevska, our Director of Policy and our Sustainability Lead.
Concerns of the pork industry regarding the introduction of the border carbon adjustment and reciprocity of standards, as well as our recommendation to ensure a balanced and effective approach. I will also inform the members that the Canadian Pork Council will be submitting a brief after our appearance to give a more fulsome response. We cannot do everything in this hour. Some of our key concerns are, first, the trade retaliation and export market risk. A major risk is that these measures could trigger retaliatory measures from Canada's key trading partners, such as tariff or restrictions on pork exports. This is particularly important and concerning given that 70% of our Canadian pork is exported. Second point is the increased compliance and administrative burdens. Introducing BCAs and reciprocity of standards will impose additional administrative burdens on our producers, particularly regarding reporting and verifying compliance with environmental regulation. These increased burdens that do not always translate into financial value could disproportionately affect producers raising their operational cost and making it more difficult for them to operate and compete. When we increase regulatory burden, we reduce the number of pork producers because it is often the operator who takes the burden of reporting and implementing these additional regulation at the expense of the operation of their business. Reducing the number of producers also reduce the economic activity in our rural areas and the resilience of our industry. These are other concerns, such as such as questions around higher production and input cost, as well as harmonization, trade disruption. But let me close with some recommendations. First point is the gradual implementation and transitional support. We urge the government to adopt a phased approach into implementing BCAs, allowing both producers and international partners time to adjust to such regulations. Also, financial and technical assistance for producers. Support mechanisms such as subsidies or low-cost financing will ease the financial burden on producers and encourage innovation in sustainable farming practices. Indeed, the study's benchmark from EU and US did not address the difference in financial support in the analysis. And I think it's a really important point. We have other recommendations, including ones on international harmonization and trade diplomacy, and the establishment of clear guidelines and simplified reporting processes. But we will share those thoughts in our brief. While BCAs and reciprocity of standards present important opportunities for leveling the playing field and promoting sustainability, it is critical to consider the potential risk to trade, compliance cost, and the competitiveness of Canadian pork producers. We urge the government to adopt a balanced approach to ensure Canadian agriculture's successful and sustainable future. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et nous...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we're open to questions now. Thank you very much, Mr. Roy. And now, Ms. Grossenbacher, for 5 minutes, please. Good morning. I'm going to speak English, if that's all right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm here representing Farmers for Climate Solutions as Director of Policy and also as a farmer myself. I farm just on the outskirts of Gatineau on the other side of the river. While the concept of carbon border adjustment, what we call CBAs or BCAs, is still in early stages in Canada and it's not an area we've studied directly, we really welcome this important discussion. In addition to my opening remarks, I have shared with the clerk a brief that I hope can be considered in part of the study with additional material, background material, that hopefully can help you. But today what I wanted to emphasize is really 3 points. One, carbon border adjustments are increasingly common and are beginning to really shape or influence trade dynamics. Carbon border adjustments, CBAs, are not just theoretical. They are already being implemented in the EU. The US is thinking about it, and many other countries. These adjustments have begun to reshape trade dynamics, as I mentioned, and influence the decisions of our trading partners. Number two, reducing carbon intensity is really crucial. While, and I think you heard from panelists 2 days ago, that regardless of the global status of CBAs, it's imperative that we focus on reducing carbon intensity of our Canadian agri-foods sector as soon as possible. While Canadian farmers do really well on some areas in terms of carbon intensity, we really don't do well across the board, and that's something we need to fix. And more importantly, a lot of other nations, the States, the US, are investing far more into reducing emissions and climate resilience than we are. According to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, to close that gap, we would need to invest $2 billion per year over the next 5 years. Right now, we appreciate the $1.5 billion that has been implemented for agriculture and climate since 2021, but a lot more is needed. But more importantly, my third point is that we need to support farmers and ranchers to remain competitive in light of climate change. A recent poll we did with Léger across the country with farmers and ranchers, when we asked them open-endedly, what is the top concern that you have for the next 10 years? The top answer we got back is climate change. Moreover, a large majority of farmers and ranchers said that they were really concerned. Well, actually, 79% said they were concerned that it would reduce yields. 76% said, 79% is reduce yields, 76% is reduce income, and 69% was impact on their health, mental health, or the mental health of their employees. And there's more information about that poll in the brief that I shared. So there's a clear need to enhance support for farmers and ranchers to help them reduce their carbon intensity while enhancing their farm viability. Then the good news for me is right now we're doing a study looking at the best ways to reduce emissions and also strengthen climate resilience on farms and strengthen farm viability. And what so the research is coming out soon, but it turns out that there are 16 best management practices that we looked at. And together, those best management practices have the potential of reducing by 16 million CO2 equivalent emissions from farms through proven and tested techniques like reduced tillage, enhance efficiency fertilizers, adding legumes to rotation, cover cropping, rotational grazing. Again, these techniques exist, they're proven, they're cost effective, and really they have a positive impact on both farmer incomes and the environment. So really they're a win-win for farmers, the environment, and the economy. So whether or not CBAs become a reality around the world, we must prioritize increased funding to support farmers and ranchers to reduce their carbon emissions and really to improve their competitiveness. There's a strong consensus with the ag sector, and actually we heard that yesterday at the CAPI conference, that what we need right now as farmers is more economic incentives, knowledge transfer to adopt better climate resilient practices, and data management at the farm level. These investments are critical for supporter farmers and ranchers in adopting high resilience, low emission practices. And again, discussions at the Sustainable Ag Strategy Advisory Committee, our national poll, the results of this report all go and say the same thing. So let's act now to equip our farmers and ranchers with the resources they need to thrive in a changing climate. Together, we really can ensure the sustainable and competitive future of Canadian farms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Grossenbacher. We'll now turn to the period for questions. I'll turn over to Mr. Barlow for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here with us today. Certainly we heard from the officials on Tuesday and Mr. Webb from Global Institute of Food Security that there is a lot of unknowns when it comes to dealing with this particular policy. And maybe for Mr. Harvey, certainly understanding your position with CAFTA and the importance of agricultural trade, I share a lot of your concerns that you raised that this would simply be, and I guess first, this is a hypothetical. No one is talking about doing this for the agriculture industry as far as we can tell. The EU is going to implement something in 2026, but not agriculture won't be covered. But just looking at our previous relationship, and I'm talking about specifically Canadian beef, durum wheat, some of those things that I look at this as a protectionist measure or potentially protectionist measure where countries in the EU, we will think we have a standard that we're supposed to meet. However, when push comes to shove, they will come up with something that there's no way we're going to meet this standard. Or each individual member of the EU, for example, will have its own little niche rules. How important, if this was something that was going to happen, I guess first, how critical is it to have an international recognized standard, a standard of measurements on how you are measuring the elements of that, whether that's carbon sequestration or soil health, and who would ultimately oversee that or administer that to ensure that it is being leveled fairly across the board? Any work that CAFTA's done on that?
So not yet, actually. When we got the invitation, some of us thought, if it's a little bit early, so we haven't developed a position on this, but we have developed a sustainable trade principles, which provide us this framework for looking at sustainable trade issues. And really what we want is to prevent sustainability measures from becoming trade barriers. So then you go to where would work be done. So first, we haven't got to a point of saying we think it's a good idea necessarily to do work. But what we want is to avoid countries having different measures that then create a lot of uncertainty in the international markets. So at the global level, the World Trade Organization is really the heart of the rules-based trading system. Most agricultural trade takes place under WTO rules. So whenever you can have WTO rules, that's by far the best. Then if that's not possible, like-minded partners sometimes, groups like the G7 can be places to multilateralize preliminary solutions, ideas, approaches. But when things aren't decided at the WTO, almost inevitably you're going to have patchwork rules, and that's problematic.
Yeah, thank you. And I certainly understand that CAFTA doesn't have a position on this yet, and I think that that's a good point that I think we're a little early in terms of taking this on. And I think it more of a comment here maybe than a question, but I think we have to start looking at partnerships with like-minded rural-based trading jurisdictions like Canada, the United States, Australia, members of the TPP, to start pushing back on the EU on how they are managing their trade relationships. And again, wheat and cattle are a great example of the dangers of following that path that is more ideologically based and not science-based. And I guess maybe to Mr. Waugh, that would be the lead-in. If we're going to talk about these trade barriers and harmonization of regulations, Prop 12 in California now spreading across the United States, where individual states are changing the playing field. What kind of an impact is that going to have on Canadian pork producers? And are you starting to see the implications of that in terms of we need to be aligned with our most trusted trading partners, and you're seeing state legislatures changing the rules?
Yes, I will start, Mr. Chair, by underlining that pork has also significant trouble to import or export our product to the EU. So wanted to make sure that it is also part of our concern. Beef, wheat, and also pork is not able to go on the European ground easily. In terms of the question of the Prop 12 and all these non-tariff trade barriers, we have major concern, and we believe that it is something that we have to push back and that we have to be really concerned when there are new rules that are added, such as plan for BCA. If we have 30 seconds, I would pass the concern that we have about financial, and Katrina would answer it.
Yes, with regards to, just to add to that question, I'll be quite short. I think we definitely, as Canada, need to focus a bit more on how we define sustainability, what those standards mean, because there's a lot of misunderstanding on the definition itself, and I think that's quite problematic, especially with our partners in the United States. But if we review studies with OECD that have been done, I think Canada is doing much more on sustainability rather than other countries where EU is importing their pork and beef. So we have to do that type of analysis as well to see where we stand, of how we actually represent and how we measure and report sustainability. I think we're a very good advantage at that point. With respect to the study itself and the financial aspects, I think it's very important for us to consider that once, and we know the EU is already doing some of the analytics and statistics on that part of how the standards will have applications. I think for us it's very important also to dive in a bit on the financial projections of the standards and how that will apply for the producers, but for the industries itself, because it doesn't start with producers, it doesn't finish with producers, it's the whole value chain. I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is it Ms. Taylor-Roy? We're going to start with you. Okay, Ms. Taylor-Roy, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here. I apologize for being a little late. I was actually talking to turkey farmers about some of this on the street on the way over. And I think that the point of this study that we've undertaken is not to talk about us putting on border adjustment mechanisms yet. It's really to talk about what's happening elsewhere in the world, in the EU, in the United States, and the contemplation of these border mechanisms and how we can help our producers to ensure that we remain competitive in world trade. So I appreciate, I'll call you Katerina because I cannot pronounce your last name. I appreciate, Katerina, what you said about our farmers doing very well when you look at sustainability and the need for more definition on that. And my questions I'm going to direct to you, Ms. Genevieve Grossbacher. I think I've got that right. Okay. You know, there's some comments that if this was going to happen, we have to look at it in a certain way, but I don't think it's if anymore. We see, I think it was the OECD has listed 73 different price or other mechanisms to control carbon emissions that countries around the world, national and subnational governments, are putting in right now. And I think this is the direction the world is going. So you mentioned in your introductory remarks that you're doing a study that has 16 different recommendations. And I didn't catch how much of a reduction in CO2 did you say could be attained by looking at spreading some of these practices, which our farmers are already using in many instances, throughout the industry?
Right. No, thank you so much for the question. And yeah, we really appreciate that. So our study is coming out soonish. We actually studied 44 practices. Most of the 44 practices are really no-brainers, cost-effective. We should implement them. But of those, 16 specific ones would lead to 16 million ton reduction by 2050. But overall, if you look as a sector, our research has shown that actually by 2030, we could get between 15 and 16 million ton CO2 reduction with the right support. Right? That is key here. And by 2050, it's more than 31 to 51 in that range. And again, what you said is really key, is the 16 that I was talking about, the 16 that can lead to 16 million tons CO2 equivalent emissions reduction are practices that farmers currently use and are proven, like reduce tillage and enhance efficiency fertilizers are really key too. And one thing that we could really do, what's missing there is support. Farmers right now are feeling like they're in the field, they're feeling the brunt themselves. They're on the front lines of climate change. They need to support to be able to adopt and scale up those practices.
Thank you. And I hear that loud and clear, that no more support is needed, even though we're 1.5 billion doesn't seem to be enough, but we are working on it and realize that it's a very important part of our agricultural industry. So it sounds like when we're talking about putting in the standards that are happening around the world and how they might affect Canada, that definition of sustainability and perhaps the multilateral approach through the WTO is what you're all saying, if I'm hearing correctly, that this is the way to go. And I know there are also already guidelines, and I can't remember the name of them, that are already in place. It's, I think, a Latin name for them, but of certain requirements that are needed right now for the phytosanitary, I think it's called, regulations. Would you see adding the sustainability requirements into that same kind of framework that is currently used by the WTO? And maybe, Michael, you could answer that one.
Sure. So again, we haven't actually made a decision on whether or not this is a good idea, but in the context of different countries taking on the idea, then it's much better to do things multilaterally so that we're all working under the same rules and preventing disputes. And if that were the case, the WTO is the best place. The multilateral solutions, such as the G7, are better than nothing, but not as good as the WTO for different reasons. One is that the WTO has a set of rules that are easier to add on to. It's actually a legal body. And the other one is that it's the whole world, essentially. So we trade with people who aren't part of the G7, China, India. So the WTO is where everybody we trade with is.
Thank you. And finally, for Mr. Roy, I like your last name, by the way. I just wanted to, we've met before, and as I've told you, I have cousins who are in the pork industry as well. I'm wondering, you talked about the administrative and regulatory burden on farmers. And I'm thinking, perhaps larger farmers can handle it better. It's still a pain, but the small farmers in particular, how would you recommend that it be, what recommendations for us do you have for ways we could support farmers in dealing with these burdens, these new administrative regulations that likely are going to be a result of CBAM being implemented by the EU and other countries?
Thank you for the question, and I believe that this is a really great point to raise, that it's not all entrepreneurs who are at the same level of understanding and implementation, and the size of the business has an impact on their ability to cope with the new regulations or requirements. So one of our proposition is that there are some money that are invested. We have a carbon tax. It was promised to be revenue neutral in the sense that the industry could have some part and reinvest it, and there is a possibility to have some information infrastructure that will reduce the burden of the businesses to report this information, and this would help to make sure that everybody can strive through these new regulations.
Thank you. I certainly want to make sure that our farmers who are doing so well on sustainability standards benefit from that. And I think competitively in the world we will. So thank you for the input.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Maintenant, M. Parent, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
And now Mr. Perron for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Roy, well, we can continue in the same vein. You talk about having information infrastructure in order to help standardize things, but we already have obstacles. You mentioned Europe, where your meat can't be sold. And I anticipate the moment where we might be able to get meat that will be produced by completely different standards and with a completely different, a more significant environmental impact. So I'd like you to tell us, how can we ensure that it is fair for everyone when we start adding on these standards? I think that it's inevitable these standards will be coming down the pipe. So I'm listening to you. Thank you. First of all, I think that's a very good point to raise. The whole issue of reciprocity of standards, I'd like to bring to your attention, dear committee, on a point that we discussed between producers, the whole issue of eco-washing. Bill C-59, there's a link to be made with that and the work that we're doing here, where there's an imposition of results on our industry. We have to ensure that we're not doing this eco-washing and the work that we're doing with consumers, but that we have an American product or a Brazilian product. Are they going to have the same constraints? We strongly doubt it, because the Canadian jurisdiction is setting out these limits, and we can see that this kind of pressure on our industry can create a disadvantage or an imbalance in the competitiveness. Thank you. That's a really interesting component. And when Ms. Glossenbacher talks about the importance of assuring support for the producer, and which Mr. Harvey will like what I say here too in terms of equivalencies. We all know that agriculture in the United States is much more supported than in Canada. So that's one example, but there are others. So 30 seconds on that, please. Katrina?
To the point and the discussion itself, I think it's very important. Even with the greenwashing bill, we're not supposed to have claims that are not in line with certain verification processes, whereas as a country we're also struggling of what do we actually report? What are the national indicators? What indicators should be taken into consideration? What are we measuring? And I'll take the National Inventory Report as an example. Every time when we are in a discussion with the government and speaking about all the implications and changes that our producers have made on the farm, we usually get a response where they're saying that, well, the National Inventory Report doesn't necessarily include all on-farm practices. So there is a huge gap between of what we are reporting, what our methodology nationally is requiring, and what we're doing on the farm. There has to be a data management strategy where we do support the national reporting with on-farm practices and how we report it. This is very important. Mr. Rowe did mention that we need support, knowledge building, skill development, and data infrastructure to support producers of how that measurement is being done.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Grossenbacher.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear you, Ms. Grossenbacher, on the same issue. Thank you for having raised that point, indeed. As you said, there are several, the RBC studied the question, there are disparities in terms of investment for climate change and sustainable farming between the United States, Europe, and other countries. That's what the report found. And in fact, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture found in its submission for the budget for 2025 that in order to reach parity with the U.S., we'd have to invest $2 billion a year over the next 5 years. So we all know, and I understand the fiscal realities, the financial realities of the government, we need more money than ever, except that every dollar we invest now in agriculture will bear fruit, because right now we're investing this money in different ways. If we look over the last 3 years, the payments for the agricultural support programs have tripled. We went from 1.75 to 1.88 billion per year or something like that. So in that context, producers need support, but what we're asking for is not to end those insurance programs, but to invest intelligently in building climate resiliency for producers so that we can reach a parity and level the playing field. So in order to do that, we'd have to invest $2 billion over 5 years. Thank you very much. You talk about not doing away with these support programs, but we could improve them because I don't think it's working properly. I think everyone here agrees with that. I might have 30 seconds left. We can perhaps come back in my next turn of 2 minutes. How can we improve what producers have already done? That's often raised in this committee here. I don't want tomorrow morning to start comparing ourselves to a farmer in Brazil who's dealing with different problems. So how can we do this? In 30 seconds, please. Well, it's a good answer. Do you have to be supported, the farmers, and do you have to ensure that there's a market for their products? First of all, to have incentives, or rather not to have disincentives for doing the right thing. So currently, I'm not saying it well, but there are many things that we can do with our own supply management program to have positive impacts for producers rather than doing the wrong thing. I didn't say it very well, but you understand.
To you for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here this morning. Some are familiar faces from the International Trade Committee. I'm going to start with Ms. Grosenbacher. You mentioned I think everybody's been talking about the United States for obvious reasons. It's probably one of our big export targets for all our agriculture. You mentioned that the United States was thinking about some sort of border adjustment mechanism or something like that. Could you maybe expand on that as to what the U.S. might be musing about?
Well, no, thanks for the question. And all I can say is I'm not an expert in the trade aspects. And all I know is that the United States and maybe the others can testify have been thinking about implementing such a carbon border adjustment similar to what the EU has done. But it's really in early stages. And it looks like they would implement it in a way that's similar to the EU with only focusing on steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and a few other things, so not to the whole ag system. However, what I was referring to is the U.S. has been investing for the past few years massively in climate resilience and building the climate resilience on farms. That's where we haven't. And, well, no, that's not true. We have, and we are really thankful for the $1.5 billion that has been invested. But we need a lot more. And now, again, I can't stress that enough. The more we do today, the less expensive it's going to be tomorrow to adapt. So that's what we hope can be done.
And if you could, you did list a number of practices that farmers have been doing. Some of them are, as you say, no-brainers that most farmers would do anyways. But perhaps you could just get into more detail on what if we had a $2 billion uplift over 5 years, where would that go? Where would the best places for the government to support farmers to transition, or whatever, maybe that's not the right word, to go to more sustainable farming practices for climate solutions?
Right. No, and thank you for that question. And we're actually working to detail that a bit more, but we did propose something for the budget 2025, or that we hope could be implemented even in the fall economic statement. And I know we're asking for big money, but we have a proposal for $861 million per year to go specifically to build climate resilience. And what we think was needed is threefolds. Again, building with what you said are the priorities of the sector. Technical assistance or knowledge transfer, right? We think a big portion should go to that, and I can give you the breakdown later. But a lot of the money should be in incentives to help farmers adopt the best practices, and then some money on data measurement at the farm level. So I don't have the full breakdown right now, but I could share that with the committee afterwards. But roughly $861 million just for that would go a really long way.
I'm going to turn to Mr. Roy. United States is, I know, one of your major export places that our port goes to, along with Japan, as I understand. Have you been monitoring what the United States has been musing about in this regard, whether it's a border adjustment mechanism or some other ways of dealing with the things that they've been providing their agriculture sector that might impinge on our trade?
Yes, we have monitored it. At the moment, that the larger concern that we have is much more on the non-tariff trade barriers related to animal welfare, such as Prop 12. Now the concern has started, or the question has started related BCAs or these kind of measures, but because we have a large access to this market, we are also working with our counterpart in the United States, the pork producers, and we want to make sure that there is alignment before there is implementation of such rules. Otherwise, it creates so much disruption, and the translation of measures of environmental measure must be clear before we start the process. Otherwise, we will go into a lot of friction in the trade. So as we propose, it's really important to make sure that we have a clear guideline. We establish standards before we establish such measures.
Okay, and I'll turn now to Ms. Kolomashevska. You talked about data. Ms. Grosenbacher was talking about data in terms of reporting what farmers are doing back to the government and vice versa. Can you elaborate on that? What sort of supports you would like to see to make that data collection easier and more effective?
Sure, no problem. So first, it will be identifying some of the common indicators across the industry. We know we have different industries, different sectors. However, identifying commonalities with the best management practices that we can number many of them can be part of those indicators on data measurement and collection. Another important aspect that was also mentioned by the colleagues is the fact that we need best management practices. And one of much missed best management practice or tool that can be applied for producers, for all producers, that is not much mentioned within Canada, or much research has been done to it, is precision agriculture. Precision agriculture helps a lot, and EU has been very strong with precision agriculture. It's expensive, but it works. It provides you data, it provides you cost efficiency, it helps everybody. And I think investing in research, particularly to see how precision agriculture can support producers across the agriculture sector, can benefit everybody, including the Research Society as well. I mean, we do have research studies that are focusing on what type of music animals like. Lovely, I love it, but is that a priority? Is that priority for everybody? I don't think it is. I think there are very other important aspects that we should focus that will help even the provincial governments and the federal government of how you communicate that data and how it goes up to the national level.
We're going to have to leave it at that. Mr. Cannings, you get an extra 40 seconds, so I expect to be on your Christmas card list this year. The chair has been generous. Go ahead, Mr. Barlow. I think you're going to lead it off in the second round.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to split my time with Mr. Lehoux, but Mr. Roy, you brought up a question I didn't have time for in my first round, so just really quickly, you know, the Global Institute of Food Security did an incredible study last year highlighting the efficiency of Canadian agriculture compared to other jurisdictions. But Bill C-59, the greenwashing bill, will prevent Canadian agriculture from talking about the incredible achievements that we've made. If we're talking about a carbon border adjustment or these types of policies, how would this legislation impact your ability to, A, talk about what you're doing in your industry, and B, meet some of these potential guidelines if you aren't able to actually talk about what your achievements have been in your industry? And maybe Mr. Harvey, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I'll start with Mr. Roy.
Yes, for us, it's a concern. There are several. I've discussed with some of my colleagues in the agricultural sector, and we were so concerned about this bill that some of us have changed or just removed all the good things that we are doing, that we are presenting on our website, because this is a concern that some people will raise a flag and say, here, there is a problem, and we will be sued in court. There is a real impact for us to be able to communicate the good things that we are doing. And as it has been mentioned, we are one of in the leading class regarding sustainability. but we want to be against a standard that does not even exist, the one of greenwashing, which is so large and so unclear that it creates a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Liu.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to perhaps have an answer to the same question from Mr. Harvey. In fact, we don't have that within our institution. I just read that in the papers like the average man in the street. Okay, I'll come back to Mr. Roy. You made 4 recommendations, and one of them, I think that we are respecting it. The third, which talked about harmonization globally, I know that Canada is an exporter, but we import 40% of our food as well. So how can we harmonize these trade rules in order to be able to ensure that what comes in at that 40% that we import meets our own requirements that we have here at home? Well, as a business person, I'd start by proposing that we don't add more rules that are impossible to comply with. I think that's the first point. Once it's done, we have to ensure that international trade complies with what we do at home. We said that in terms of some Asian countries where we had problems. What's important as well is that there's communication that occurs before these rules are put in place. So before imposing them, that we are already aware of what the rules of the game are. So it has to be well set out internationally, otherwise we will lose. Thank you. That means better harmonization with our partners, our trade partners. But also domestically, we have to ensure that before adding any additional rules, that the people on the front lines be informed. I think that's an important point. We often arrive with a rule that we're putting in place, but the people on the front lines haven't been informed of it. So there has to be a certain timeline before taking those concrete steps. In terms of risks, because you broached the subject with certain trade partners in Asia, that we had some quite serious problems in the past. So how can we limit those kinds of difficulties? You talked about bans on electric cars, for example. I mean, how do you foresee this? It'll be difficult to manage. Well, there's a political aspect to it. It will be more difficult to set the parameters on and control, but I'd like to bring to the attention of the committee the issue of the trade agreement that we have with Europe, which is supposed to be based on science. But then when it's applied, there are asymmetrical rules where they decide to impose further rules on us that are not scientific. So if we agree on science-based rules, it has to be on both sides and not one-sided. Thank you very much. That's your time. Thank you. And now
we have the pride of Malpeque. Over to you, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I just want to go back to the first round, and I heard a couple things that, I feel that we're in a situation here where we're actually trying to get out in front of it, and I, Mr. Harvey, you said something about we're not sure yet. Maybe we're getting at this too early, and to me, I've been sitting around government for 9 years now, and it's like, it's never too early for government because bureaucracy doesn't move very quickly, Mr. Harvey. So I think it's important that we do get out in front of it. And there's a lot of issues, obviously, and a lot of unanswered questions. And there are some, theoretically issues that we're dealing with. But, I mean, it's something that I think is extremely important that we do come together as industries and governments at all levels. And no one's talking about the provincial governments, but I think they have a major role to play in this as well. But and science-based, obviously, the unilateral trade. I mean, the U.S., and I've said this at this committee before, but if they move on this, we better be ready because
I mean, in the pork alone, it's over $1 billion, I believe, exported to the U.S. So I think it's understandably there's a lot of questions, but it's also understandably that we're acting now as opposed to having you come back here someday and say, we need more time. So I think that's really important. But I also think, and Mr. Leroux touched on this a little bit, I think our farmers in Canada, whether everybody recognizes it or not, and sometimes that doesn't happen in the media, obviously, but I think we're in a very good position. And I mean, I think when you look around the world and see what everybody else is doing on sustainability and in regards to climate change, our farmers are leading the way. So to me, yes, trade is trade, and you're always going to have those obstacles that, what the Pork Council runs into on the EU and so on and so forth. But I mean, as far as putting our farmers up against anybody in the world, I think we're in a very good position. One thing that wasn't mentioned that I think could be very unfair if we're not ready to act on this, or could be very, very beneficial, is if we don't meet the trade obligations through cross-border tariffs to another country, the tariffs that we're paying those countries are going back to those industries. And no one's really talking about that. And I think that's something that this government and the advocacy on your guys' behalf should be certainly pushing for. And maybe we get to that $2 billion relatively quickly. So I guess, what are the opportunities, and anybody can take this, what are the opportunities for our farmers in Canada if this does in fact take place, which we assume it's going to? So anybody can start. Just go. Sure, Mr. Roy.
I would start by saying that having the proper information infrastructure to be able to demonstrate to our trading partners all the good things that we are doing is essential. And this is much more on the public service side, because it's an infrastructure. It cannot be private. It has to be something that is common, that is regulated, that is standardized, and that help us as producer to be able to demonstrate to the world what are the good things that we are doing and how we are leading. We are leading in the world. And this is, for us, it's a little bit frustrating because we hear a lot of people saying, we are not doing this and that well. But in reality, we are a kind of an A+ student, and we are saying, I would like to have the bonus. Yes, it's good to have the bonus, but let's make sure that we compare to other in the world and that we are able to compete with the right standard, and that we are not diminishing ourselves by just looking at the little problem that we have.
Anybody else?
I can just say where we are right now. So I agree. We need to be on top of things, but we're at the monitoring phase. So I don't represent the seafood sector, but I'm going to be shucking a dozen Malbec oysters tomorrow night. But that's not an international trade issue. What's an international trade issue? Today, the European CBAM doesn't cover Malbec oysters or Canadian agri-food products, right? We're watching it's covering steel, cement, fertilizer. That's starting to get towards agriculture, but it's not there. So today it's not covering. So today, for Canada to be implementing a border carbon adjustment on similar products from other countries would be Canada going it alone and doing something that's trade restrictive, and that would probably lead us down a path that's complicated for us with partners. We do see people talking about things. The U.S., just like I said, we don't have a position because we're not faced with it today, but I read American trade blogs and Substacks and stuff to do my job well. I see that some U.S. senators have discussed the issue. It's not totally clear to me. I haven't hired somebody to study how close that is to getting adopted, if it's like a private member's bill that rarely moves, but sometimes it does. And so I know that people in the U.S. are talking about it, so we're at the monitoring phase. If the world starts moving toward, Canada shouldn't be leading and doing that and starting trade disputes out of nowhere. If different countries in the world move towards it, we'd be having a different discussion, and we'd be coming back saying we should be doing this with our partners and not going it alone, because what we always want to be doing is strengthening the rules-based trading system and not tearing it apart.
So we're at time. The one thing I'll say, Mr. Harvey, is we had officials before this committee on Tuesday, and the position of certainly from the departments, is that there's contemplation, there's work being done because of other countries. This study wasn't originated on the idea that the government should necessarily establish one, but more about how Canada should respond, given the fact that this could be a reality down the line. And I just want to make sure that's clear. Go ahead, Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Grossenbecker, I'd like to come back to you with the time that we have left. You have 2 minutes to explain what you were trying to explain earlier. And I'm speaking to all the witnesses here. Do you have proposals or recommendation? Mr. Roy seemed to have several. It's important to send them in writing to the committee, to all the members, so that we can include those in the report. So I'm listening to you now. Well, perhaps I could come back to put the question in context. It was a good one as to how to compensate producers. I grow vegetables. We like carrots. And we always like carrots more than sticks. I want to say, and to come back to Mr. McDonald's question, if we set up CBAs or BCAs, we have to ensure that there are more carrots than sticks, not just punitive measures, because we believe that the best defense against regulation is to ensure that we are ready. And I agree, we perform well in terms of climate resiliency and other components, but not on all. So producers need help. Yes, we're doing good things, but we still need support. And the incentives could be a top-up for Agri-Invest, for example. These are ways of encouraging the adoption and of these things, and to continue in the same vein. And I'll come back to it there as well. There are a lot of producers who say to us that what we need in order to get to the next level is to have more technical support. As technical assistance, as Mr. Roy said earlier. We have certain services in Quebec, counseling services, where we had better coverage for young farmers, for example, to help them. And so those kinds of programs could exist at the federal level as well. So that can do even more than these advisory committees we have. But we have people who are trained to help farmers adapt to climate change. There's really a shortfall there. And I'll give you an example, if I may. As a producer of vegetables, I had one economist who came from Montreal, and she was visiting 7 farms at a time over 2 days. So if we were lucky, we saw her 2 or 3 times for an hour over the course of the summer. My neighbor who grows corn has a person who comes several times a week. So we don't have the same level of support. You have to train them. You have to give them training, that they have the necessary training to go on out in the field. Mr. Cannings.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Mr. Harvey, and just, we've been hearing today that these border adjustments haven't been implemented anywhere for agriculture. There's a list of other sectors that EU is looking at, and they seem to be sectors that are much easier to measure. It's much clearer where the benefits might accrue to Canada, for instance, going down that route. And from what we heard in their last meeting and this meeting, it sounds like agriculture would be a very difficult, complicated sector to put into a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because every farm is different. So I just want to ask you, I think the same sort of question I've been asking others, in terms of the United States, our biggest trading partner. Where do you think Canada should put its efforts and its money to supporting agriculture in Canada to help us deal with trade with the United States? I come from an agriculture riding that is just swamped with American product. We grow fruit. We go to the grocery stores. All the fruit we buy in our grocery stores is from the United States. So I'm just wondering if you could comment in general terms where we should be putting our efforts and our funding to support Canadian agriculture in the trade aspect?
I think right now we should be getting ready for the 2026 CUSMA review. I think Canadian trade efforts around the CUSMA review should generally be at trying to keep that review as narrow as possible, because there's a lot of political risk for Canada if that review gets too wide. But at the same time, Canada should be preparing a list of things that it doesn't think are working as well as they could with the United States. Because if the discussion did widen, we should be ready to discuss things. But our initial effort should be to try to keep the discussion as narrow as possible, because there's a lot of political risk for Canada if we open that discussion up.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question from the chair. I mean, one of the things I think is interesting about this study is I've heard consistently from witnesses, and I would agree, that Canadian agriculture would be either top shelf or maybe even superior to most other agri-food products around the world, certainly on an index from carbon intensity. And we've heard that about 10% of emissions in Canada are tied to agriculture, global average being 30%. And even within comparator countries, I think Canada's doing quite well. Obviously, one of the elephants in the room has been around carbon pricing. We've heard about that. It's largely exempt, but Mr. Roy, you talk about things like natural gas, propane still existing. But whether or not it's carbon pricing or it's, to you, Ms. Grossenbacher, the idea of actually more government subsidies, more taxpayers' dollars going in, that does have a true cost in the sense of a Treasury sense. How do we actually account for that? And that's what I think this committee is trying to establish, is how do we make sure that Canadian superiority on some of these products is actually accounted for, but also for asking our domestic industry to be part of the solution on reducing emissions, which I think the science is clear we need to be doing that across a variety of different sectors. For countries that are choosing not to ask their domestic industries to be a part of that, Mr. Harvey, I take your point that you said it's early. Politicians are rarely accused of that. I think that's probably good that we're thinking a little bit ahead. If not a carbon border adjustment mechanism, is there some other type of policy that you think is important to protecting Canadian competitiveness in an environment where we are asking domestic industry to be part of that solution and the costs are being borne, whether it be on a carbon price or whether it be on additional subsidies that ultimately come from the Canadian taxpayer? How do we account for that in the system? Is it a club approach? Is it either you're doing something and therefore you're not subject to a tariff, or you're not and you're a baddie and you are subject to a tariff? Like how do we get there? Any thoughts?
So I guess the CAFTA perspective is that we've got a global rules-based trading order that works very well for Canada and has allowed to export around the world. The majority of Canadian agriculture is export-focused, and everything we do should be trying to strengthen that system and not weaken it. If we think it's very important to take certain domestic measures for our domestic reasons that cause problems for the trading system, we should be going multilaterally and trying to work on that with other countries, because otherwise, if every country goes on its own, we're going to split into blocks or worse into specific countries, and we're all going to be poorer.
Around trade is important. I think it's how do we account for this, and that's where the question becomes, because if we're asking either more taxpayers' dollars or pricing. Any further comment from? Okay, just quickly.
I think it's very important, and a very important aspect with whatever we're discussing is information management. If we are able to better manage our information, not work in silos, I think we will have 95% of the answers. Instead of being defensive, we can actually have a stand. It is and I'll give you a simple example. We have granting programs going from the provinces down to the producers on implementation of best management practices. Do we have information on the implementation, monitoring what's happening with the BMPs? We don't. They're in the inventory over there, and there is no follow-up. If we manage to work with the provinces of actually getting the information from whatever is being implemented through the granting programs down to the producers and follow each implementation grant the producers are getting, we will have much better understanding of what is being done on the farms. Simple example, even within our institutions, like cross-sector collaboration, there's a lot of data available on animal vaccines, on animal health, that it's not necessarily being integrated into the sustainability info and data. We can use that, work with them. So collecting, there's so much information that we're doing so much, but everything is being done in silos.
But that really comes back to the point of trying to establish international norms or standard. And I think what I think where this is going is it's going to be more of a club approach. Either you're doing something demonstrably and you hit a baseline, or you don't, because I think otherwise it's going to be very challenging. So anyways, interesting conversation. Thank you, colleagues, again for the brief indulgence. I'm going to, on your behalf, thank our witnesses for your participation today and for your contribution to agriculture. We'll suspend just briefly and we'll bring up our next two witnesses. Thank you. Colleagues, we're back for the second panel. Francis, Yves, I'll get you guys to get into order here. But colleagues, we've got from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, Mr. Tyler McCann, a managing director, no stranger to this committee. It must be we must be in double digits now over the years for sure. And from the Canadian Canola Growers Association, Mr. Rick White, who is President and Chief Executive Officer, joining us by video conference. Thank you, gentlemen. Apologize for the slight delay. We went a little bit long in the first panel, and some good conversation here in the room. But we're going to get right to it. I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. McCann, for up to 5 minutes, and then I'll turn to you, Mr. White, afterwards.
So my opening remarks are in French and English. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to appear before the committee this morning. I always appreciate the opportunity to contribute to your work. The issue of international trade and sustainability is one that CAPI has been working on for years, and I'd like to present my thoughts on the intersection or collision between the two.
To frame any conversation on sustainable trade around a couple of really critical facts. The world is facing increasing food insecurity. Supply, demand, and stocks of key commodities are tightening. There are fewer net exporters and increasing net importers. Not all food is created equal. What it is and how it is produced all play an important role in its environmental footprint. Transport, especially ocean freight, actually has a very small impact on most foods' environmental footprint. Therefore, trade will increasingly be essential to ensuring that food can get from the small number of countries where it can be produced in abundance more sustainably to those countries where they cannot produce enough to meet demand. While economists and trade lawyers have long explanations for them, I would say that border carbon adjustments are there to ensure a level carbon playing field between countries. But how do you measure the carbon, and how do you know if the playing field is level is immensely more complicated than that. That is one reason why I would say that BCAs are not likely to be an issue for the food system for the foreseeable future. While the EU is moving ahead with BCAs, the coverage is limited to 6 emissions-intense, trade-exposed products that are covered under their EU emission trading system. Fertilizer is the only agriculture-related product impacted by the BCA. Agriculture production is not covered by the EU ETS, and there is no serious dialogue that it would be covered by the ETS or the BCA. The world is struggling to figure out how to deal with carbon at the border, but this is an incredibly complicated and the solutions are not evident. It is not likely to be that a border carbon adjustment will be the solution to that problem. While it is not an agricultural commodity, it is important to recognize the impact that a BCA could have and is likely to have on Canadian fertilizer. Luder Adiger, a recent CAPI doctoral fellow, put out an excellent paper exploring the potential impact of a BCA on fertilizer. The recent tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports have shown how much of a negative impact tariffs can have on Canadian farmers and should motivate Canada to seek out a different approach. Setting aside fertilizer for most Canadian agricultural exports, the EU deforestation regulations are a significantly greater challenge than a theoretical BCA. It was positive to see yesterday that has been delayed by a year, but there's a lot more work to be done there. And while much of the attention on the collision between sustainability and trade focuses on regulatory and border measures, it's important to not lose sight of the impact that domestic policies have and green spending could have on Canadian exports around the world. The increasing use of green subsidies in the U.S. are a great example of sustainability measures that have a potential to negatively impact Canadian exports. At the WTO, the green box is typically seen as not trade distorting, but I think that that's an antiquated view of the world. J'aimerais aussi faire quelques commentaires sur la réciprocité des normes.
I'd also like to make a few comments on reciprocity of standards. It's easy to understand why Canadian producers are concerned and support the concept of reciprocity. They produce very high-quality food and don't want to be forced to compete with imported products that aren't of the same quality. Nor do they want to compete with products produced with inputs that are not available on the Canadian markets. But the solutions are not as simple as the concerns. First and foremost, the Canadian government has the power to ensure that imported food is safe for consumption and meets Canadian requirements. Whether they have the resources is another issue. The issue of standards reciprocity is really a question of competitiveness, not food safety. Beyond potential conflicts with international trade rules, standards reciprocity remains a difficult approach to implement without adding friction and doubt to the food chain. A better approach would be to encourage greater harmonization of standards, regulations, and approvals for agricultural inputs. For example, Bill C-359 creates conditions that can ensure access to competitive technologies without creating a thicker border and less functional international trade.
Develop solutions that continue to improve agricultural sustainability while promoting trade and supporting food affordability. However, adding taxes and barriers at the border are not likely to have the desired impact. It is through collaboration and cooperation between governments, farmers, and food producers around the world, not barriers, taxes, and regulations, that we will find the solutions needed to meet the productivity growth required to deliver the economic, environmental, and social sustainability that the world needs out of its food systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCann. We'll turn it right over to Mr. White.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee to discuss the impact of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. As the chair had indicated, my name is Rick White, and I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. I'm based here in Winnipeg, and we have an Ottawa-based team as well. CCJ is the National Association for Canada's nearly 40,000 canola farmers, representing them on issues, policies, and programs that impact their farm success. Developed in Canada, canola is a staple of Canadian agriculture as well as science and innovation. Today, it is Canada's most widely planted crop and is the largest farm cash receipt of any agricultural commodity, earning Canadian farmers over $13.7 billion in 2023. Annually, the canola sector contributes $29.9 billion to the Canadian economy and provides over 200,000 jobs. Canola farmers are heavily trade dependent, exporting 90% of what they grow as seed, oil, or meal, while importing critical crop inputs like fertilizer and crop protection products, farm machinery, and infrastructure. Exports alone were valued at $15.8 billion in 2023. We urge the government to exercise utmost caution when considering a carbon border adjustment mechanism and to do its due diligence to ensure any such mechanism does not go against the principles of international rules-based trade. It is imperative to balance Canada's climate change ambitions with our economic competitiveness and our global trade reputation and commitments. Additionally, any design should fully account for Canada's World Trade Organization commitments, as well as respect our bilateral free trading agreements. The WTO's framework underpins our international trading system, offering clear and predictable rules on trade. The mechanism's design and details will determine trade compliance, and any deviation from that could open Canada to potential trade disputes, criticisms of protectionism, and undermining the mechanism's stated objectives. Our partners at the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, also known as CAFTA, stated before committee last week that it is essential that sustainability measures do not become barriers to fair and free trade or serve as cover for protectionist trade policy. CCJ is fully aligned with this statement. CAFTA has also developed principles of sustainable trade, which would be an excellent resource for this committee to review. While other countries may have similar goals to reduce greenhouse gases and achieve carbon neutrality, approaches to carbon border adjustments are not standardized and are likely not easily harmonized. A patchwork of regimes has the real potential to enact barriers and disrupt trade, increase the possibility of a double carbon price, and create new and possibly cumbersome accounting regimes for both government and industry. Engaging early in the design process increases the chance of a multilateral approach and having Canada's approach recognized as equivalent, most notably by countries such as the US and the European Union. With international trade as the lifeblood of our sector, canola farmers need to remain competitive in global markets. Any mechanism must consider the cost increase of imported products and mitigate impacts on downstream users. Fertilizer, fuel, food and beverage, steel, and aluminum are highlighted as emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. Farmers rely on fertilizer imports for specific nutrients not produced in Canada to grow and realize crop yields, whereas steel and aluminum are required to produce tractors, equipment, and storage bins. For example, targeting primary steel production could potentially shift the cost to end-use products like combines. Farmers are ultimately responsible for any increased cost, and as the last link in the value chain, and with grain prices set globally, they can't pass on any of those increased costs. While CCJ understands Canada's commitment to achieving ambitious climate change targets, we are also wary of the negative impacts that this mechanism could have on open trade, and thus the trickle-down effect to farmers. Given the current trade investigation China has launched on canola in response to Canadian-imposed tariffs on EVs, steel, and aluminum, canola farmers, now more than ever, need the Canadian government to follow international rules-based trade principles. Given these considerations, CCJ recommends the government exercise extreme caution and thoroughly consider unintended consequences of implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Any Canadian CBAM must maintain our global competitiveness and be designed to align and be recognized by our major trading partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. And just to clarify, because it has come up in some of the testimony around the idea that the government itself is trying to establish a Canadian. No, I think the origin of the study was more around other countries potentially moving down this route and how best to respond. So I certainly appreciate your testimony, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Barlow as a starting point for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. We had representative of finance here yesterday, and I asked them a similar question, and their response was to implement a carbon border adjustment and all the administration that will go around that, the costs and the efforts would be, in her words, intense. We now know that the cost just to administer the carbon tax is about $83 million, and close to 500 bureaucrats to administer that program. We know the carbon tax is costing farmers about $150,000 on average per farm, $1 billion in lost revenue to Canadian farmers by 2030. To Mr. McCann or Mr. White, I'll ask, what would be the cost of a carbon border adjustment in terms of the cost to the farmer or the cost to administer, in terms of not only maybe dollars but effort in terms of implementing a program that would be navigable, let's say?
So I think that the short answer is we don't know, but potentially quite significant. The design parameters around a potential border carbon adjustment could require pretty intense reporting from the farm gate to the exporter. We don't have the systems in place. A lot of good work is being done around building efficient measurement reporting and verification systems, but we really are still a pretty long way off from having something that could easily be put in place. And I think we also have the unfortunate reality that anytime government has had to step in of late and try and put a governmental touch around these systems, the experience has not been positive, right? And we need to acknowledge that there's a high risk that this will end up being, the risk is already good that it will end up being a burden on the sector that's difficult to cope with, but it will end up likely being more of a burden than we think it's going to be based on our past recent experience.
Mr. White?
Yeah, great question, Mr. Barlow. It's difficult. I can't really comment on the administration costs. I can only imagine how expensive and complicated it would be. But again, I don't have any experience in that area. But focusing on your question about impact on farmers or price impact, what we're worried about is if this goes ahead and it's a blanket approach, there will be winners and there will be losers. And I believe that farmers will ultimately end up losing on the imports of critical inputs, like I mentioned, fertilizer, machinery, crop protection products. We import a lot of those products, and if those products have taxes attached to them, their input costs go up, their margins collapse, and we go from bad to worse. We already have the China issue right now and that's a big problem for us. The last thing farmers need is more uncertainty about the cost of their and availability of their inputs. So again, without knowing the detail, the devil is in the detail. And so to proceed with this with caution and think of all the circumstances of the winners and the losers, this is very risky in our view. But again, hard to comment on theoreticals right now, but where the rubber hits the road, be able to answer that question more thoroughly.
I appreciate that, Mr. White. Thank you. And I guess on one specifically, fertilizer costs were up more than 100%, directly attributable to the carbon tax, as it is now a 35% tariff on fertilizer from Eastern Europe, and now perhaps a carbon border adjustment on fertilizer as well. Maybe not from Europe necessarily, but those are all added costs that are passed right on to the producer as a result of the carbon tax and tariffs that have been put on. The other interesting thing that was raised was Bill C-59, the greenwashing bill. And I know, Mr. White, Canadian canola producers were highlighted in the Global Institute of Food Security study on the incredible efficiencies and achievements of Canadian agriculture. I think the one on canola was that our carbon footprint on canola is 67% lower than canola grown in other jurisdictions around the world. If you were to try to achieve the standards set by a carbon border adjustment, but you're unable to actually talk about the incredible successes of Canadian agriculture as a result of the greenwashing bill, what kind of burden does that put on you as an organization and representing thousands of farmers if you're not able to talk about the incredible achievements that Canadian farmers are already doing and setting the standard globally?
Yeah, I mean, we need to tell our story because it is a story of success and achievement and the culmination of farmer ingenuity, research and innovation, quick adoption to technologies, zero-till machinery, precision ag, all those things. Farmers are in the business of minimizing their costs and minimizing the disturbance on the environment in their production. And it's a story that needs to be told. And if we can't tell it through greenwashing bill, or because of that, I don't think we're serving our customers around the world. We're not answering the questions that they have. And I think it would be very much shortchanging our ability to tell our story and to explain how, why, and what we're doing about sustainability and all the good things that we're doing to the individual environments that are on those farms. I think it would be a critically missing pieces of information that would be missing from the conversation globally.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. Mr. White, just for the committee's clarity, is your understanding of the current bill that you couldn't talk about no-till agriculture, or just so we're clear on that bill, is that the testimony you're giving?
Well, I think where we are concerned is the legalities of what we can say and what we can't, and we're not going to take chances of going against Canada's laws on greenwashing. We'll be ultra-conservative, and so it'd be tempering our ability to do that. So it really is a risk of, not that we are trying to greenwash it, we would never do that, and we don't have to do that. But at the same time, you have to kind of think in the back of your mind to be cautious about what you do say publicly because of the lingering potential liability.
Thank you. Mr. Drouin, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much to our witnesses. I certainly appreciate all of you appearing before this committee on an issue that I think is not going to impact the ag community tomorrow, but if we don't start preparing, it will impact our ag community in 5 and 10 years. And I'm not talking about Canada imposing carbon border adjustments. I'm talking about other countries, and it's going to become a reality for, and I think there's been testimony for the steel industry, the cement industry, our Canadian fertilizer industry who's exporting to the EU. This is all becoming an immediate reality in 2 years. I know there's EU auditors currently right now assessing the supply chain of our steel industry in Canada right now. And I know the biggest barrier right now to imposing carbon border adjustments is measurement and how do we measure. But there's a lot of Canadian universities working on that. Universities across the world are working on that. Farmers are putting a lot of pressure across the world on their own legislatures. If we talk about CETA in France, the reason why France has not adopted CETA yet is because of their own farmers who had massive protests, and EU farmers who had massive protests on what they call mirror clauses, but those are reciprocity clauses. And part of that discussion is imposing CBAMs on jurisdictions that may not have similar environmental laws to what they have. And that's why I think it's important to have this conversation now so we can prepare and we don't come back in 5 or 10 years with our pants down and say, oops, we should have done something, because it takes a while to transition. And I agree that Canadian farmers are doing an amazing job. We have to tell that story better. We have to ensure that the way we measure our carbon footprint is and it is science-based, it's pushed and it's accepted across the world. Our biggest trading partner, we've got Republicans and Democrats talking about imposing carbon border adjustments. We've had 2 bills already presented in the Senate on this particular matter. So I know that it may seem far-fetched for some of us, but it is going to become a reality. I can see it. If we are to continue trading in this world, there's going to be more pressure to stop carbon leakage. And my question is, and we're not talking about Canada imposing carbon border adjustment mechanisms. It's how do we prepare, how do we make sure that Canada is best prepared to face that? And of course, we've got our trade vehicles and our trade institutions that we can go fight WTO, et cetera. But how do we make sure that Canada is prepared to best equip our farmers here in Canada? And maybe I can start with Mr. McCon.
I think it is worth it in addressing one comment that you've made and that the chair made earlier. You know, last summer, the government of Canada, the finance department, consulted around Canada's approach to border carbon adjustments. I think that it's quite legitimate for kind of the stakeholder community that's trying to navigate and understand where the government may go on this to think that this may be something that Canada's considering to do, because I think that that's effectively the last thing that we saw from the finance department was a consultation saying, should Canada do this? So I want to acknowledge that. One of the good things that this study has done, I think, is remind us all that Canada is not an island. And what we do in Canadian agriculture is part of a global system, and that level playing field and that need to be competitive, both from an environmental but from an economic perspective, is really important. And so I do think that we do need to be a lot more thoughtful around what are we doing today to prepare for that changing landscape in the future. And there is a potential that carbon is part of it, biodiversity is something gets talked about, but the reality is, for all of that talk, the action continues to really be around subsidies that largely we're not being competitive on, or effectively very little action at all. And so I think we're all trying to navigate this. How do you deal with this kind of rhetoric around the need to take action and the reality that Canada has been one of the countries that has been more aggressive. The carbon tax and its impact on agriculture, it's important to keep in mind that Canadian agriculture is one of the few agriculture systems around the world that is paying for a price on carbon that way. That is one of the differences that's there. And so we really do need to be a lot more thoughtful about the fact that, you know, this is a complicated changing landscape. The landscape is going to change in the future, but we should maybe just end on, we should show leadership around what solutions look like. Like, the world is in need of creative thinking and new approaches that reconcile economic and environmental sustainability, that improve our sustainable food system while ensuring that profitability and livelihoods of farmers around the world. A lot of the instruments that are available today are pretty blunt and not very effective, and I think Canada could do a lot more to say this is what our Made in Canada approach looks like, and we don't see, I don't think, Canada leaning into that as much as we could.
So part of the issue is that the world's changed, right? A few years ago, we've had a U.S. presidency that wasn't afraid to impose tariffs. We've had all parties agree on EV and steel tariffs in Canada. So the world is changing, and those particular tools, I would call them non-trade barrier tools, or tools that impede trade, are now politicians are not afraid to use them. And G20 is talking about carbon border adjustments. They are talking about this. It's part of the conversation, whether you go to COP, I don't know what they're at now, 28, 29, 30, but they are talking about this. So it starts from there and it comes back, it trickles down. So I'm just afraid that if we don't start making sure that we give the proper tools to respond to that, then we will leave our farmers in a non-competitive position in the near future.
But we shouldn't reduce it to border carbon adjustments, right?
No,
There's a lot more
but other
tools in the
countries will
tools
do
box,
that.
and we should
Yeah.
have a lot more thoughtful discussion around what does that competitive landscape look like.
Yeah.
That's why we're doing the study. I do see your hand, Mr. White. We are at time, but I would like to offer you just a very brief comment if you'd like.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging me. Very briefly, I'd just like to say that we should not forget about the WTO. This has been coming up over the last 5 years, originating from the Food Systems Summit in Rome, and made these arguments time and time again. This is coming, and this is coming now. And rather than trying to match or coordinate carbon adjustments at the border, we need to deal with it at WTO and a trade agreement so that everybody plays by the same rules, so that these rules don't become disguised trade barriers and distort trade. We need to focus as much time on WTO and improving that so that it can handle the trade complaints that will come from this, and make sure that it's science-based, evidence-based, and it can be measured scientifically. So that all countries are abiding by that. So I'd just like to not forget about WTO and augmenting that, and we should be leading the charge on that message. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes.
Now, Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. McCann, I'll begin with you. We spoke during the first panel, how we can recognize what's already being done by agricultural producers in terms of new policies and standards. You mentioned that we have to be vigilant, that the standards we're currently talking about are not yet in place, but it's not a bad idea to study them, indeed, before they are implemented. So I'd like to hear you on that. Thank you. I'd like to come back to the point that we should be vigilant about everything that's happening on the front lines. There are several issues that are coming up today that could have an impact on competitiveness, on our exports, and on our imports as well. And I think that sometimes we have a habit of just looking at one part of a bigger issue. And sustainability and international trade is a very broad piece, and we have to be more aware of all of the components of that and ensure that all these components work together, and be also aware of the impact of domestic policies, but also of the domestic policies in Europe and the impact that has on the whole issue of sustainable agriculture. Okay. I like the aspect that you're raising here of having a global vision of things, because I'll hear a lot about the fear that these will become non-tariff barriers, and we know that we already have a huge problem with that in terms of pork and meat that's supposed to be able to be exported to Europe, and it's not happening. So Mr. White raised the idea, if I understood him well, we'll hear in a few seconds, but of starting discussions with the WTO. How do you see that? Should it be something that's international, first of all? And secondly, how do we support our producers? Because they are competing with people who receive a great deal more support than them. So it's already uneven. And how do we ensure that it doesn't become even more so? Well, first of all, I think that it's clear that Canada should be a champion of the WTO. We should be one of the loudest voices in supporting what happens there and to strengthening the role of the WTO today. I think that we should be more conscious of the fact that, once again, this morning Genevieve talked about carrots and sticks. Other countries seem to be handing out carrots more than us. And I think here in Canada, we like sticks, perhaps. a little too much. So we should have a better reflex in terms of how to best support people and using carrots rather than sticks. Well, I agree with that. We all like carrots better, I would say. But perhaps just not for Chinese products that come in at a too low price and compete with our producers. But how do we recognize in 30 seconds what's already been done? Well, I don't believe that we have found a good solution for that recognition. It depends what we're talking about. If it's recognition of a financial recognition, do we want to support people? Do we want to ensure that when we talk about carbon at the border, is there a balance between what's happening here or versus elsewhere? It's a challenge. But we also should be clear, for example, that the work that we've done with no-till farming, the producers themselves got the benefit of that investment and those practices. And sometimes the work of this recognition is hard, and I think that's part of a very important debate. Thank you, Mr. White. Same question?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to, again, I just want to assure that we're thinking more globally and making sure that the multilateral trade agreement that we already have is able to help us and help others around the world determine what's a trade barrier and what's not. The difficulty with carbon adjustments spread all over the world is how do you determine equivalency? Who is going to arbitrate that? We already experienced that a lot with the EU. We don't do it their way, therefore they won't allow it in. And not based on science particularly. And I feel and I sense that is going to happen in this case. It's going to get worse, and we need the WTO to be able to be strong, have wording and agreed chapter maybe on this. I don't know what it is, but it needs to bring some semblance of commonality and rules around this so that trade is not impeded. I want to branch off just a little bit, if I may. This feels and it looks like it's protectionist, and it's happening all over the world. And this is an example of a protectionist type of adjustment. You could call it a corrective adjustment, but I would call it protectionist because traders will look at it as protectionism if it's impeding their ability to trade. We've already experienced that with canola right now with China. A protectionist measure by Canada triggered a venomous attack on our industry, and farmers are going to pay dearly for that decision that was made by Canada to put up tariffs on China. And farmers don't deserve that. So that is a big issue. That's an example of what we want to avoid.
Thank you, Mr. White. We're unfortunately at time, but I wanted to make sure you had the point to be able to say concerns around protectionism and the trade piece. Mr. Cannings, over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. McCann. And I think, we're talking here about a hypothetical situation sometime in the future. Maybe there might be carbon border adjustments on the agriculture sector. We've been hearing it's going to be very complicated, and it's certainly not likely to happen in the very near future, as the EU is moving in other sectors. And I think one of your themes of your opening statements was harmonization. The way we can best prepare for this in many ways is try to harmonize our practices with our major trading partners, in particular the United States. You mentioned C-359. I don't want to take the chair's thunder away from that. He might want to ask you directly himself. But if you could mention some of the real key ways we could harmonize our agriculture practices, our subsidies, anything we do to support agriculture with the United States as a start to help us prepare for a future that may have a carbon border adjustment.
I think I'd like to first start by making the point that I think it's good to be paying attention to these issues that are going to happen in the future, but we have issues today like what do we do about the EU deforestation regulation that I'm not sure are getting the full attention and support and service that they need. And so I think that is also one of the points that I want to make, that we need to make sure we're adequately addressing the issues that are in front of us today before we get too worried about the issues that are in front of the future. But if you look at kind of this need to reinvigorate multilateral approaches and collaboration across countries, we've seen the U.S. show leadership around a sustainable productivity growth coalition that's aiming to try and increase dialogue, collaboration between countries around what are the tools that we need to implement sustainable productivity growth, what are the practices that can be used. As an example of an effort we held an event, it's going yesterday and today. Yesterday morning, we had the Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for the Cooperation on Agriculture come and speak, and he talked about the need to better align approaches across the Americas. I think that there's a huge amount that Canada could do to show leadership, to help support capacity building and investments, to ensure that there's more coordination and consistency across policies there. And I think that there is, unfortunately, a bit of a tendency, again, to look away from the good work that groups like IECA are doing, that we could be supporting more, that proactively and positively encourage a more consistent level playing field. Again, use some carrots internationally rather than relying on sticks.
Well, thank you. And we've also heard several witnesses mention, I'm sure you heard the conversations around how important better data would be in all this. When you have a complicated system that is being proposed, it's one thing to calculate, the carbon intensity of steel production versus, beef production. When you have cattle out on the range, you have cattle in feedlots, you have cattle being shipped back and forth. I heard somebody else mention, when you have vegetables that are being taken from various farms and places and put in the same bag, how important data is in general in this world, but it's certainly in a case like this, and how the government could support that for the agriculture sector across the country in all sorts of ways, whether it's through StatsCan or whatever.
I think that there's a huge opportunity for the government to facilitate, enable more work around measurement and reporting, and to do it in ways that reduces the potential burden. I think one of the things that we see in Europe is that one of the reasons why the European Commission is not that aggressive on an emissions trading scheme on agriculture is just because it's so complex to really get a good, accurate, reliable measure. And it's not just a measure, but what do we do? One of the things that has a huge impact on the agriculture sector's emission footprint every year is whether or not it's dry or wet on the prairies. So even if you can actually measure the carbon footprint, what do you do with your border carbon adjustment when all of a sudden we've had a really wet year and the carbon footprint of our Western Canadian crops goes up? Like, these systems don't lend themselves to the same types of measures and approaches that a steel plant does. Like, they are fundamentally different systems. That organic system that exists in agriculture is just so wildly different that we do. Again, it's not just a matter of measurement. Even once you have the data, what do you do with it, and how can you use it in a way that achieves these outcomes is really, really tough.
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning rain. I was just thinking intuitively that if you had a wet year out on the prairies, the carbon footprint would go down because there would be more carbon sequestration, but it shows you how much I know. Mr. White, if you'd like to comment on any of that in terms of harmonization with our major trading partners.
In about 30 seconds, Mr. White, I know you're capable.
Okay, thanks. Message received. Yeah, in 30 seconds or less. Harmonization, you have to have it. You have to know what you're measuring. You have to know what you're adjusting for. My conceptual gap here is, what is the problem that we're trying to fix here? I'm not clear on what exactly it is we're trying to fix or curb. Is it philosophical? Is it protection of certain aspects of our industry? What exactly is it? If we had clarity on the purpose and the objective, we can figure out the measurements and the tools that needed to fix that problem. I'm not exactly clear if this is an academic exercise or not. But I agree 100% with Tyler. We need the data. We don't have the data, and neither do other countries, to do this properly. Thank you.
I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Rood for up to 5 minutes. I'd also like to recognize that Mr. Epp from Chatham, Kent, Leamington is here on the committee. Great agricultural writing and good advocate. But over to you, Ms. Rood.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. And Mr. White, I appreciated your comments earlier to my colleague, Mr. Barlow, when you're saying farmers do everything we can to minimize our costs. And we see that our costs are up year over year for farmers, and the carbon tax plays a big part in that, especially I would think on the prairies when we're hauling a lot of grains and canola in particular from the fields back to the farm gate, and those transport trucks, of course, have to use fuel, and that diesel fuel used in those trucks is not tax exempt, contrary to some of the beliefs that we hear from other parties. And we've seen that the data on the carbon tax that has come out, even from the Liberals' own government data, is that since that carbon tax has been imposed, we haven't actually seen a reduction in emissions. And then we're talking about now putting on another layer of, these carbon border adjustments. And what concerns me is we haven't actually talked about a food security aspect of these new measures. And we know that we have seen huge increases in food bank usage numbers over the past several years. And I'm just curious, either Mr. McCann or Mr. White, what do you see as the core food areas that are most likely to be adversely impacted? And will these inflationary pressures create a ripple effect through to food markets elsewhere, leading to more food insecurity potentially?
It's a great question. I hadn't really thought of it as a food security because we're awash in food. From a canola perspective, we grow way more than we consume domestically. So if food security is domestic, we're good. If food security is more global, maybe not so good, because our product does feed a lot of people globally. On the carbon tax part of your question, that is one area that the government needs to reconsider, especially for farmers. Bill C-234, speaking of sticks from Tyler's earlier comments, 234 would alleviate the stick on farmers. And I guess my suggestion here is that this is coming up again in the House on October 26. C-234 in its original form is our preferred approach. However, the reality of the situation, and without much faith in the Senate, we would encourage the amended C-234 go through immediately. It won't help as many farmers, but it will help farmers in need right now. And we need an early harvest for those farmers to get some tax relief for them. The reason that the emissions are not going down is farmers do not have any alternative, and it becomes a straight up tax. And so this stick is just acting on farmers as a club, and they can't do anything about it except take it on the chin and reduce their bottom line. So please get 234 passed and get some relief to those farmers. And a lot of those farmers are feeling the brunt of China right now, and they're going to feel a lot more of it in the next 6 months.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Mr. McCann.
I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this because I think it was the last time I was in front of the committee. Some of the members took some creative license with some of the things I said about data and the carbon tax. You know, it's the basic premise of a carbon tax is to make things more expensive. That, like, if the carbon tax hasn't made food more expensive, it's because it's kind of failed its policy objectives. And I think you've got to call a spade when it comes to what kind of the premise of that objective is. You know, but I think the reality is it's not having an impact. There are much better solutions. If we really do care about emissions in agriculture, there are better approaches that will have a better impact at the end of the day.
I'll cede my last minute over to Mr. Epp.
It's about 40 seconds, Mr. Epp.
Thank you. We've talked a lot today about the impact on primarily primary products off the farm, going through perhaps a minimal step, then facing the international markets. Those of you that have ever picked up a medley of frozen vegetables, they're produced in southern Ontario. Cauliflower is often produced in Mexico. Sometimes it's floreted in the U.S., frozen, shipped to Canada, blended in with carrots grown from Ontario. The little sweet corn that you see actually usually comes from Thailand. Carrots are domestic. Broccoli can be either Canada or the U.S. It's all mixed in southern Ontario, frozen, mainly into the domestic market, often exported sometimes back to the U.S. Just think about that for a second, how you contemplate a border carbon adjustment. Second, Red Gold, one of the largest privately owned tomato processors in Indiana, Illinois and Indiana. They're actually the largest importer of California tomato paste within the U.S., but you're growing from two totally different production systems, like an arid desert in California. Now you're blending with Midwest tomatoes, which are grown quite similar to our tomatoes. They sell to a little company called Walmart, which is probably ubiquitous, right?
Mr. Epp, thank you.
How do you implement the?
Don't make me get out my gavel.
Thank you.
Your point was made. Go ahead, Ms. Murray. Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Wow, what an interesting conversation. So thank you to the witnesses for being here for this. And I'm going to just ask a few questions to try and, as an urban Canadian, understand the perspectives that you're bringing. Mr. White, you may ask the question about pricing on carbon and what are we trying to fix, and I guess I would say generically we want to limit our impact on climate change, and that is the critical thing that is underpinning the conversations here today. And Mr. McCann, you said there are better approaches at the end of the day than putting a price on carbon for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from farming and agriculture. So what are you proposing?
I'm always hesitant to go before Rick because I gather I take up a lot of the time on him. But maybe if I can just go quickly to say that again, I think that there's a pretty good literature around practices around the world around how do you support and encourage, for example, value chain solutions to the sustainability problem, recognizing that what you need to do if you're a beef farmer to reduce your emissions footprint is wildly different than what you need to do if you're a canola farmer. And so what we need to do is, first and foremost, build systems that recognize those differences and give the value chains, the farmers, the processors, and others the tools that they need to encourage action.
Yeah, maybe I'll just elaborate a bit on that. Thank you. When it comes to the farmers, they have no way to pass along the costs of these things. They don't have any alternative energy that they can move to, where a tax theoretically would work if you have alternatives and you're trying to change their behavior. They just don't have available to them the technology to switch from more fossil fuel-based system that they have right now. So without an alternative to their energy needs, they just have to pay the tax, and emissions are not respectfully going to move because they're going to continue to do what they need to do to farm the crops and grow their crops. They are sustainable. They have cut their emissions a lot and softened their environmental footprint a lot, especially canola production, which has gone to zero-till, high-tech, everything that they can do. But if they have to dry their grain,
just have a few more questions here. So that sounds to me like a great answer, that it's driven them to be innovative and move towards no-till agriculture. So that sounds like that is a positive from putting a price on carbon in some way, even if not as directly. I think I underheard that the European trading system doesn't cover agriculture carbon, and so the border carbon adjustment is not likely to cover cover issues as either. Like I didn't understand that, and I would like a clarification as to how a pricing system that is an international one could be put in place that would help to drive productivity and reduce emissions. Any thoughts about that?
So one of the reasons why they've done it on steel, for example, is that there is a price on carbon in Europe if you're a steel producer. but there is no price on carbon in Europe if you're an agriculture producer. So you cannot use a border carbon adjustment to level a playing field if there's no price that's being paid on one side. Again, the European approach on agriculture tends to be many carrots. And if you look at what they're trying to do on soil carbon, for example, it's about how do we encourage soil carbon farming and how do we do it in a positive way. And again, they tend to do it with a lot of burden. There's a lot of issues from European farmers, but the premise is different in that they are not looking at it as a tax, but how do we do a better job building very generous incentives to encourage transition?
Maybe if I could just make a correction to your comment, Madame. On the innovation that farmers implemented, the zero-till, and substantially softened their environmental footprint, happened 20 years ago. It had nothing to do with the carbon tax at all. So farmers innovate and innovate well, even in the absence of that.
Unfortunately, we're at time, and I think a good question in all of this is how do we account for that success in the international market? But I'm going to go to Monsieur Parent for 2 minutes 30 seconds, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. White, I'll continue with you, particularly on C-234, which you just mentioned, your request for it to be passed quickly. That means that it has to get through the Senate, because the longer it stays there, the longer we'll wait. Obviously, C-282 has been there for a year, so I hope that will be voted on next week and come into effect immediately. On another issue, I want to hear what you think. How do we set up, establish regulations? How do we improve performance? You talked about working with the WTO, which is interesting, but I want to take account of what's already been done. A producer, for example, who's already rotating his crops in comparison with another farmer who's not. And we know that there's a certain quantity that's necessary to make it effective. So how do we recognize what's already been done within Canada and within Quebec, but also compared to foreign countries that we are trading with? It's not easy.
No, you're absolutely right. It's not easy because there's no direct comparison. Even when you look at a Western Canadian farm, they vary from farm to farm, from region to region, from municipality to municipality. So when you start comparing to other systems around the world, it becomes very difficult to standardize that because no one size fits all, no one size fits all across Canada. So it's hard to come up with a one size fits all approach to something at the border. Just because of all those differences. I'm not trying to overcomplicate it, but that's the practical reality of how systems are done. And I strongly believe that farmers, when it comes to sustainability, they know what works on their farm and what doesn't work on their farm. And every single one of them are thinking about generations to come because they want to leave that land in better condition than they received it. And so the incentive for ongoing continuous improvement on the sustainability front is inherent in their DNA and in their business models and in the future of their families. So trying to standardize that through regulation, very difficult, a very big challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Thank you, Mr. Parent. Mr. Canning.
Well, thank you, and I'm going to go to Mr. White because you've been getting short shrift all day, so I'll start with you on this, and it's because you mentioned I think some of the challenges that all sectors have when it comes to international trade. Your sector in particular has been impacted by the decision to put on heavy tariffs on Chinese EVs and steel and aluminum coming into Canada because China has immediately hit back at one of Canada's big sectors, and that's canola, So, and you also mentioned the impacts that a carbon border adjustment might have on incremental costs to your farmers. If we put a carbon border adjustment on steel and aluminum, it might increase the cost of farm equipment, for instance. I mean, I would argue that if you're looking at for cheap steel, it's going to come from China, and that might be moot now that those tariffs are there. I'm just wondering if you could maybe expand on that and the complication. This is a complicated thing, and this is another aspect of that.
Right. No, thank you for bringing up China again. Actually, I'll take this opportunity to say that CC is involved in the anti-dumping by China on canola. Big deal is going to be significant impact.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chairman, the signal is cutting out.
Mr. White, with your internet connection, I'm going to...
Can you hear me now?
Just keep going, and we'll see if we get translation.
I'll start. I was just going to elaborate on the China issue, that CCA representing the 40,000 that we represent are part of and participating and have registered.
I'm sorry, Mr. White. There's some type of internet instability right now with your connection. So I'm sorry. We're going to have to just pause that. Mr. McCann, would you like to just try to chime in, or just briefly?
Maybe just to emphasize how critically important this issue is and how much it underscores that we need to have a much more thoughtful approach to Canada's relationship with partners around the world, both the U.S. and China, and I think that there's, again, not easy solutions for Canada and what we need to do, but we need to be much more aware of the consequences. And I think this should not have been a surprise. It seems like at times it may have caught some people by surprise, and we need to do a better job preparing and being prepared to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Cannings. Just one quick question for me, and Mr. White, we can see if your internet issue has been resolved. But I think it's been very clear from the testimony that the idea and the complexity around a border adjustment mechanism is going to be very difficult for agriculture, both even on an importation sense or even exporting. So that's fine. What's your view, though, because, Mr. White, your organization, through grain growers and through others, have goals of trying to reduce emissions, continue to drive sustainability. That has costs. Mr. McCann, you've talked about more carrots, maybe less sticks, but that has cost to the taxpayer of this country, to the government treasury. How is that accounted for? Because we've also heard and we know that Canadian agriculture is competitive in an intensity sense on carbon. Is your view that we just don't account for that internationally, that Canada is not able to actually have a competitive advantage in that conversation, or that we should simply continue to subsidize heavily to get environmental outcomes without ever having that accounted for countries that are not doing the same internationally? Like, is this a club approach where you kind of have a club of countries that are actually doing something and they're not subject to perhaps some type of tariff, and then countries that are demonstrably doing nothing should pay? Because, like, if I was to talk to farmers across the country, they say, I understand it's important on environmental sustainability, but I don't want to be undermined competitively in the world. How do we square those two things? If not a carbon adjustment mechanism, is there any leadership? Is there any kind of consideration, or are we just trying to decouple those two things completely?
Well, I think it's important. You talked about who's going to pay. I mean, it doesn't need to be governments. It could be consumers. It could be others that help farmers make the investments that they need to. But I think that there's this sense that there's a value out there for low-carbon food that likely doesn't exist. I think one of the challenges is that it's hard for us to look around the world and see which countries are actually willing to spend more for Canadian food because of its low-carbon footprint. And it's one thing to have this kind of rhetorical thing about, we want, but the reality is that it's very hard to find people that are willing to pay for more sustainable outcomes.
Mr. White? Oh, I think we're having issues again with your sound. We'll end it there. We have a little bit over time, but I think that's a reflection of the good conversations that we've had and the interest more broadly in the topic. Colleagues, we will be back at it next Tuesday afternoon. On your behalf, I'd like to thank Mr. McCann, Mr. White, for your testimony and your contribution and leadership in agriculture. And we'll see you on Tuesday. Meeting adjourned.